President Nixon arrived here in Manila about...
I think history will judge Richard Nixon favorably for his foreign policy. The Nixon trip to China was one of the great diplomatic moments of all time. It was an act of great political courage. I felt he was a tragic figure, of course, with the cover-up of Watergate.
5 men apparently caught in the act of burglarizing and bugging Democratic headquarters in Washington.
That whole Watergate thing, again, proving that it's not the original sin, but the cover-up that gets our politicians or any of us into trouble.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
People understand making mistakes, but they don't understand lying about them afterwards. I first met Ronald Reagan during the California presidential primary in 1964. He wasn't in politics at all at that point, but he was the crowd warmer-upper for Barry Goldwater, who was speaking at Knott's Berry Farm. It's an amusement park south of Los Angeles. Well, as Goldwater was beginning his speech, Reagan came down, and he stood next to us in the press down there, and standing right next to me. And I was looking around at this crowd of Goldwater fans with their crazy hats and their pom-poms and their little signs and all that junk, and I turned to another reporter and said, "This isn't Knott's Berry Farm, it's Barry's Nut Farm." Well, Reagan overheard it, and he started laughing, and then he stopped, just dead stop, and he turned to look at me and he said, "I don't think that's very funny." Reagan was an exceedingly likable guy, just a heck of a nice fellow, despite his politics. He was funny and loved a good joke. The dirtier, I'm afraid, the more ethnic, the better. I don't think he brought very much to the presidency except charisma and success.
Fly me to the moon. Let me play among those stars.
I've rubbed elbows with a few showbiz people in my time, too.
Like on Jupiter and Mars.
Frank Sinatra became quite a close friend and remained so. This was despite an interview that he granted to me. I said, "Tell me, Frank, what about these allegations of mafia connections?" Wham! He got up a seat, stormed out, called to his attorney and said, "Come with me." And when they came out, they'd reached a compromise where if I asked him a couple of questions phrased with some delicacy, he would answer about it.
It has been uttered and printed so many times, and we just can't continue to try to fight something that has no basis, because you just tire of it after a while.
You make me feel so young. You make me feel like spring has sprung. Yeah.
I don't think there's any question that Frank was absolutely incredible talent. We all know that. But his personal behavior became obnoxious at times, partly under the influence of drink, I think. He was a very warm human being. Why he had this ugly temperamental side, I don't fathom. I don't know.
With a love like that, you know you should be glad.
Then there were the Beatles. It's a little-known fact that Ed Sullivan discovered the Beatles on the CBS Evening News.
Yeah. Those are the Beatles, those are.
We were offered a piece by a London bureau of this phenomenon. So we put it on the air one night. Well, my gosh, we were hardly off the air that Ed himself was on the phone to me. We were good friends, and Ed said, Walter, tell me about those kids. Tell me about those kids. What kids, Ed? You know, those kids you just had on the air. What do you call them, the Buggers or the Beatles or something?
So, ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles. Close your eyes and I'll kiss you.
Well, anyway, that was the beginning. He just picked them up and brought them to the United States. My 2 teenage daughters were invited backstage for that first appearance. I don't think up to that time they really cared very much what their father did, but I suddenly was a hero in their eyes.
People always ask, well, what are the perks and privileges of being Walter Cronkite's daughter? And obviously that was kind of a big one.
I remember dressing up all sexy and my mother making me change. That was horrible. I hated that. But that's one of my most vivid memories of the whole thing, is my mother making me change my clothes.
You know, to see those pictures, first of all, we looked like such geeks. I can't believe it.
I think it's too far down for that, Don. All right.
Next, Cronkite Remembers, Dallas, 1963.
I'll never forget that bulletin. It simply said, shots rang out today as President Kennedy's motorcade toured downtown Dallas.
We just have a report from our correspondent, Dan Rather, in Dallas, that he has confirmed that President Kennedy is dead. There is still no official confirmation of this, however. The report from our
Good evening from the CBS News Control Center in New York. This is Walter Cronkite reporting.
I was assigned to take over the CBS Evening News in the spring of 1962.
Soviet Premier Khrushchev has called for an 18-nation
The Supreme Court today legalized abortion.
A flurry of activity at the Jack Ruby trial
We will
today.
try to suggest, at least, the enormous scope of the pollution problem alone. The ultimate risk of a meltdown at the 3 Mile Island atomic power plant.
I spent 19 years at that desk, watching historic changes in everything from the world order
President Reagan today opened
to clothes and hairstyles, including my
the
own.
impeachment of President Richard Nixon. More on the story from Bernard Shaw.
Habib said if
he was tougher than my Marine Corps drill instructors, but in terms of a living, breathing example of how to do the job, he's my beacon.
In Alabama today, Governor Wallace ringed a public school with state troops to delay integration ordered by a federal court.
The 60s, undoubtedly, were the most turbulent decade of this century.
I have a dream.
There were the assassinations.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
Robert Kennedy was shot at 12:15 p.m.
The race riots. The Vietnam War. It was an incredible decade. The 60s also brought the rather full flowering, I think, of television news. Perhaps partly inspired by the coverage of the Kennedy assassination and aftermath.
I think it's too far down for that, Don. All right. You know what I mean?
In those days, I spent my entire lunch hour right at the news desk. I just happened to be standing right at the United Press ticker when Merriman Smith, their White House correspondent's first bulletin, cleared the wires. I'll never forget that bulletin. It simply said, Dallas, shots rang out today as President Kennedy's motorcade toured downtown Dallas. I said, let's get on the air, shouting it, of course, across the newsroom.
And I gave it a great deal of thought, Grandpa.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News.
From there on, we were on camera the rest of the day.
This picture has just been transmitted by wire.
It was amazing that I really lost entire contact with my immediate surroundings in the sense that I didn't realize I was in shirt sleeves.
Let's go back. Prayers, we understand, are underway.
The fact is that any news person at a time like that is not really aware of anything except getting the story out.
Our man Dan Rather in Dallas reported that.
People asked me about my emotions during that day. Well, most of the day I didn't have keenly felt emotions.
Looking for the assassin. A report has it that the man has been arrested, that he was operating from a second-floor window.
The only time was actually when I had to announce that the president was dead officially, that we knew he was gone.
Dinner meeting there. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
And I almost lost it there.
Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly.